Hey everybody, this is the fourth here, and in this video I'm going to be taking a look at why high passing can sometimes increase the peaking levels of certain sounds, and why it might be a good idea to use a linear phase EQ to do that high passing for those sounds instead. So if you remember the Sound Explained video all about phase relationships, you will remember me talking a good amount about how your waveforms will have positive and negative amplitude values. And when you're layering multiple waveforms together, all of the amplitudes of those waveforms will be added together to create a single complex waveform. And sometimes the positive amplitude values for one waveform will be layering with the negative values of another, and sometimes it's the opposite, it will be positive with positive. And this can sometimes cause things like phase cancellation and all that stuff. And in this video, I'm not really going to be talking about phase cancellation, because what I'm looking at in this video are the different phase relationships of the different partials of a sound, and how the amplitude values of those add up. So the harmonics of a sound are far enough apart that changing the phases of those harmonics isn't really going to produce an audible effect like you'll get with phase cancellation. But you can imagine that with a certain phase relationship between the harmonics will result in the amplitudes of the various harmonics to add up in a very specific way. And if you change the phases, every phase change you make, those amplitude values of the harmonics will add up and get a little bit different of a result. And so if you look at the example of a saw wave, the harmonics and their phases add up to create a very specific waveform that looks like a sawtooth. But if you were to change the phases of some of these frequencies, the amplitudes of the harmonics will add up differently and create a different shaped waveform. And this phase change will occur to some extent whenever you EQ your sound, and it's most noticeable if you high pass, which is what this video is about. So you can see when I put this high pass on the saw wave, even though I'm not actually affecting any of the frequencies, I'm pretty well below the fundamental there. You'll see that where I was without the EQ, I'm peaking at just under -8. When I turn that EQ on, I'm all the way up at under -5. So that's about 3 decibels increase in my peaking level. And if I toggle this on and off, you'll hear that it doesn't sound any louder. It sounds pretty much the same in terms of loudness. And this peak increase is just because this EQ has changed the relationship of the different frequencies in the sound, and now the amplitudes add up in such a way that the peaking level has increased. And so if you look at the oscilloscope, you can see how this happens. So normally the saw wave looks like this. And you can see the peak is kind of about here. But when I turn that EQ on, you'll see the peak has been brought up. But if you look at the lowest amplitude down here, you'll see that the low peak is also about here. And when I turn that EQ on, it's brought up to more around here. So the waveform only oscillates between about this value and this value, but it is read as this value on the peak meter because this is the highest amplitude. So it's an asymmetrical waveform at this point, and because of that, it loses a fair bit of its power compared to the peaking level. And this is the reason that I like to use a linear phase EQ during the sound design stage on a lot of my sounds if I need to high pass them, and using a normal EQ kind of increases that peaking level. Because I want my music to be loud, I want to win the loudness war and all that. So you can see if I use this linear phase EQ and I set the high pass, you'll see that it peaks at about -8 still. It's right there with the original waveform. And if you look at the oscilloscope, it looks like a nice saw wave still. And I end up doing this fairly often when using saw waves or using a lot of distortion. So here is a distorted snare sound. And if you think about the way distortion works, it pretty much forces your sound into a certain frequency-phase relationship such that it doesn't exceed the threshold of that hard clipping distortion. And so this just makes the phase relationship of those frequencies perfect for achieving a certain peak amplitude. And if I cause any kind of disturbance to this balance, it's going to cause that phase relationship to no longer be ideal and often result in an increase in my peaking level. So you can see right now this snare sound with the distortion is peaking at about -9 decibels. And so if I use this EQ and just make a cut of a few decibels, you'd think that since I'm cutting out some frequencies, it should be peaking at a lower level. Because I am reducing the overall power and I am kind of, reducing the amplitude of those frequencies. But if you look at what actually happens when I play the snare drum with this EQ, you'll see that I start to peak a little bit higher, even though I'm making a cut with the EQ. And it's not particularly drastic there, but let's look at what happens when we high pass this snare sound. Because, if we're using this snare, we might want to remove some of this low frequency content. It's pretty messy down there. So using a linear phase EQ to high pass some of that out, we actually do get a bit of an increase in the peak level. And this is more because we are removing those low frequencies. And those low frequencies are a part of this perfect balance. So we get about, just over a decibel of increase in that peaking level. But let's look at what happens when we use a non-linear phase EQ, just your normal EQ. And we're cutting off similar frequencies, we're cutting off pretty steep, just like we were with the linear phase EQ. And you'll see the peak jumps up all the way to just below -1 in one of the channels, and just below -2 in the other channel. So that's a huge increase in your peaking level, and is really not desirable if you're looking to get the loudest mix possible. And so since I use a lot of distortion in my sound design, I regularly use, linear phase EQs to filter out any low-end content that I don't want during the sound design stage. Because like I've said before in the previous video, it's not super practical for the actual mixing process because of the latency it adds in order to maintain those phase relationships. And the final waveform I want to look at is a little bit different, because even a linear phase EQ won't be able to prevent this peak increase from happening. And this is a pulse waveform here. So you can see right now it's peaking at just below -8 decibels. And it fluctuates between about here and up here on the oscilloscope. Now the problem with this waveform as it is you can see it has quite a bit of low frequency information, and this is just DC offset right now. And you don't really want that in your mix. That's going to cause some problems in your mix. So you do want to remove that. And if you remove that using a normal EQ, you'll see that I will jump from peaking at -8 all the way to -2. So that's about 6 decibels increase. And you can see what happens in the waveform over here. The top is peaking way up here and the bottom is way up here. So it's very asymmetrical. And if I use a linear phase EQ, it's not going to be too much different. You can see it preserves the shape of the original waveform a bit better, but it still becomes very asymmetrical. And it increases the peak all the way to -3. So you do save a decibel versus using your normal EQ, but it still increases the peak level quite a bit. And the reason this happens is because that DC offset is what allows this waveform to be a little bit more symmetrical in terms of the highest amplitude in the positive and negative values. It's taken this waveform and it's just dragged it down. And so even removing that DC offset using a linear phase EQ, or even creating this waveform in an additive oscillator so that you don't have that DC offset to begin with, you are left with that asymmetry. And you can see even in the waveform view, it's an asymmetrical waveform. And so this will happen with certain waveforms, and especially like really heavily distorted sounds occasionally. The DC offset becomes a part of that perfect balance in getting the maximum power out of a sound while restricting it to a certain peaking level. And so, removing that in any way is going to end up increasing the level of your peaks. So these were just some examples of why using a high-pass filter can increase the peaking level of your sounds. And hopefully now you have a better idea of just why that does happen, and how you can avoid it in most cases, or at least lessen that increase in peak level